At my son's wedding, his future mother-in-law said loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's not a father. That's a mistake in work boots." The bride laughed and clapped like a trained seal. But my son Hudson didn't laugh. He stood up, called off the wedding in front of everyone, and did something that destroyed their family fortune the next day. "My name is Caleb Henderson. I'm 58 years old, and let me tell you how we got to this beautiful disaster. Because, friends, this story is about as sweet as revenge gets." 6 months before that glorious train wreck of a wedding, I was living my quiet life in Cedar Falls, Iowa, thinking my biggest problem was whether to rebuild the engine in my '87 Chevy or just buy another truck. At 58, I'd perfected the art of being exactly what people expected. A widowed construction worker living comfortably on my late wife's life insurance, driving my work truck, and helping out at the VFW fish fries. What they didn't know was that my modest lifestyle was about as real as Paige's future marriage was going to be. My son Hudson had been dating this Paige Ashworth for 8 months, and I'd met her exactly twice before she started planning their engagement like she was organizing a military invasion. The first time was at Hudson's birthday dinner, where she spent the entire evening taking selfies with her expensive salad while asking me pointed questions about my retirement plans and financial security. Charming girl, really. The second meeting was when she brought her mother, Savannah Ashworth, to get to know Hudson's family better. Savannah swept into my modest house like she was touring a construction site, making helpful suggestions about updating my decor and asking if I'd considered moving somewhere more appropriate for a man my age. Meanwhile, Paige was in my kitchen opening cabinets like she was conducting a home inspection. "Mr. Henderson," Savannah had said, settling into my late wife's favorite chair like she owned it, "we're just so thrilled that Hudson found someone who understands the importance of family support systems." She smiled that sharp smile that wealthy women perfect by middle age. "It's wonderful when older family members can contribute what they can, even if it's just emotional support." I nearly choked on my coffee. Here I was being patted on the head like a good grandfather who might be useful for babysitting someday. If she only knew that I'd been watching my investment portfolio grow for the past 12 years, while she was probably spending her husband's money on whatever rich wives buy to fill their empty days. Hudson, bless his heart, was completely oblivious to the undercurrents. He was so in love he couldn't see that Paige looked at our family like we were a charity case she'd graciously adopted. And honestly, I was almost impressed by her performance. The girl had studied us like we were a science project, determined to figure out exactly how much we were worth and how she could best manage us. But here's what Paige and her delightful mother didn't understand about small-town Iowa widowers. We didn't survive the farm crisis, 3 recessions, and 12 years of raising kids alone by being stupid. We just let people think we are because it's amazing what folks will say when they think you're harmless. You see, I'm not just any construction worker. I spent 8 years in the Navy before coming home to Iowa, learning discipline and strategic thinking that served me well in both construction and life. When my wife Sarah died 12 years ago, leaving me with a 16-year-old son and a $200,000 life insurance policy, I had 2 choices. I could spend it maintaining our lifestyle, or I could invest it and build something lasting for Hudson's future. I chose option 2. While everyone in Cedar Falls assumed I was living paycheck to paycheck, I was actually building a carefully diversified investment portfolio. Real estate, index funds, municipal bonds, nothing flashy, nothing risky, just steady, compound growth over 12 years. The kind of boring investing that turns modest amounts into substantial wealth if you're patient and smart about it. But the Ashworth family was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The engagement announcement came in November, and with it came Paige's first real mistake. She called me personally to share the wonderful news and to let me know they'd already booked the Ashworth family estate for a June wedding. Not asking if June worked for our side of the family, mind you, just informing me of the decision they'd made. "Mr. Henderson," she gushed over the phone, "we're so excited to make Hudson a part of our family. The Ashworth estate can accommodate 200 guests easily, and Mother has already spoken to the florist about the arrangements. Of course, we understand that your side of the family might be more modest in their expectations." I made appropriate grandfather noises while mentally calculating exactly how modest Paige was about to discover my expectations could be. Because you see, my dear soon-to-be daughter-in-law had made one crucial error in her research about Hudson's family background. She'd never asked about what I'd been doing for the past 12 years since my wife Sarah died. 3 weeks after Paige's condescending phone call, I was sitting in my accountant's office reviewing my annual financial statements when I realized exactly how I was going to handle my future daughter-in-law's superior attitude. The numbers on the page were quite satisfying. 12 years of careful investing had turned my wife's $200,000 life insurance payout into something considerably more substantial than anyone in Cedar Falls suspected. "Mr. Henderson," my accountant Parker Williams said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed my portfolio, "you've done remarkably well with these investments. Your current net worth has reached $1.9 million. I smiled and nodded like this was routine information, but inside I was doing a little victory dance. My late wife Sarah had always said I had a good head for numbers, and apparently she'd been right. While everyone assumed I was living on Social Security and odd construction jobs, I'd been quietly building a fortune that would have made Savannah's mother soil her designer panties. "The real estate investments have performed particularly well," Parker continued, flipping through the detailed breakdown. "Your stake in the Riverside Shopping Center development alone is worth $340,000 now, and with the medical center expansion plans, we're projecting returns of 180% over the next 18 months. The plans started forming in my mind like a beautiful, terrible flower blooming in spring. You see, what Parker didn't mention, because I'd never told him the full scope of my strategy, was that I'd been specifically targeting investments in properties where certain local families had stakes. Not out of malice initially, but because successful people in small towns tend to invest in the same profitable ventures. It's just good business sense. But now, knowing what I knew about the Ashworth family's attitude toward people like me, that strategy was about to become much more personal. Hudson called that afternoon, voice bright with excitement. "Dad, Paige's parents want to meet you properly before the wedding. They're planning a little dinner party next weekend. Nothing fancy, just immediate family." "How nice," I said, already imagining what I'd wear to this nothing fancy dinner party. "Will it be at their home?" "Their estate, actually. Paige says it's been in the family for generations. I guess they have quite a bit of property out in West Hills." Hudson paused. "Dad, I should probably mention that the Ashworths are, well, they're pretty wealthy. Paige's dad owns several tech companies and her mom comes from old money. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable or anything, sweet boy." He was actually worried about me feeling out of place among rich people. If he only knew that I'd been getting investment advice from the same financial advisors who managed portfolios for half the wealthy families in Iowa. "I'm sure I'll be fine, son," I assured him. "I'll just be myself." And that was exactly what I intended to do. After Hudson hung up, I called Parker back with a specific request. "I want you to research the Ashworth family's business holdings," I said. "Preston Ashworth owns some tech companies, has investments around town. I want to know everything about their financial position." "Any particular reason?" Parker asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected this wasn't just curiosity. "Let's call it due diligence," I replied. "If my son's marrying into their family, I should understand what kind of people we're dealing with." What Parker found over the next few days was fascinating. The Ashworth family business empire, while impressive on the surface, was built on some surprisingly shaky foundations. Preston's 3 tech companies were heavily leveraged, with 2 showing declining revenues over the past 18 months. His investment portfolio was diversified, but many of his holdings were in properties and developments that were struggling in the current market. More importantly, Preston had significant stakes in several of the same development projects I'd been quietly investing in over the years. The Riverside Shopping Center project that Parker had mentioned, Preston owned about 15% of it. The new medical complex development that was driving up property values across West Hills, Preston had invested heavily, but he'd bought in late and at much higher prices than my early positions. The beautiful irony was becoming clear. While Preston Ashworth thought he was the big fish in Cedar Falls' investment pond, I'd been swimming in the same waters for years, accumulating positions that would soon give me significant influence over his financial future. But the real revelation came when Parker dug deeper into their personal finances. The Ashworth estate, that generational mansion Hudson was so impressed by, was mortgaged to roughly 75% of its current value. Savannah's old money wasn't as old or as substantial as it appeared. Her family's fortune had been significantly reduced by failed business ventures and expensive lifestyle choices over the past decade. The Ashworth family was wealthy, certainly wealthier than they assumed I was, but they were what financial advisors call house rich and cash poor. They had impressive assets, but also substantial monthly obligations and a lifestyle that required constant cash flow to maintain. This information made me smile in a way that probably wasn't very Christian, but I'd stopped worrying about being perfectly Christian around the time Savannah Ashworth started explaining my limitations to me. "Parker," I said during our final conversation that week, "I want you to prepare some documents for me. It's time the Ashworth family learned what Caleb Henderson is really worth." The Ashworth estate turned out to be one of those sprawling colonial mansions that screamed, "My great-grandfather made this fortune during the tech boom, and we've been coasting on it ever since." The circular driveway could have parked 20 trucks, and the front garden looked like something from a magazine about gracious living. I pulled up in my F-150 behind Hudson's modest Toyota, both of us looking like we'd gotten lost on the way to the service entrance. Paige emerged from the front door, wearing what I suspected was a $500 cocktail dress, her smile so bright it could have powered the house's exterior lighting. "Mr. Henderson," she called, giving me one of those air kisses like we were long-lost relatives. "Welcome to our family home. Mother and Daddy are so excited to meet you properly." The interior was all marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of furniture that costs more than most people's annual income. Savannah Ashworth glided down the grand staircase wearing pearls that probably cost more than Hudson's yearly salary, her husband Preston trailing behind like a well-dressed shadow. "Caleb," Savannah said, taking my hands like she was blessing me with her touch. "How wonderful to finally have a proper visit." Paige has told us so much about Hudson's family. I'll bet she had. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have seated 30 people comfortably, though it was just the 6 of us around one end of their mahogany table. The conversation flowed like expensive wine, with Savannah and Preston sharing stories about their recent trip to Europe, while Paige hung on every word like they were recounting the secrets of the universe. "We just adore traveling," Savannah explained, cutting into what I suspected was very expensive steak. "Last year we did the Mediterranean, and this spring we're planning something special for Preston's 65th birthday, perhaps a private villa in Tuscany." "How nice," I said, taking a sip of wine that probably cost more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a week. "Travel is broadening." Paige leaned forward eagerly. "Mr. Henderson, Hudson mentioned you've never been outside the Midwest. We were thinking that after the wedding, you might enjoy visiting us when we take trips, as family." The condescension was so thick you could have cut it with the silver butter knife sitting beside my plate. Here they were generously offering to include the poor construction worker in their glamorous lifestyle, probably expecting me to weep with gratitude at their charity. "That's very thoughtful," I replied, wondering how they'd react to learning that I'd been considering buying a vacation home in Florida with my investment returns. But the real show began when Preston started talking about his business empire. 3 tech companies, 2 investment firms, and what he called various other ventures that were apparently doing quite well. He had that particular swagger that wealthy men get when they're showing off for someone they consider beneath them, explaining market strategies and business principles like he was teaching a kindergarten class. "The key to success," he informed me, gesturing with his wine glass, "is understanding that money makes money. Most people never figure that out. They work for wages their whole lives instead of making their capital work for them." I nodded thoughtfully, as if this was the first time I'd ever heard such wisdom, while mentally calculating that my portfolio had probably outperformed his various investments by at least 15% over the past 3 years. My Navy training had taught me patience and strategic thinking, qualities that served me well in both combat and compound interest. "Of course," Preston continued, warming to his subject, "it takes capital to make capital. Most working folks never accumulate enough to get started properly. They're stuck in the paycheck-to-paycheck cycle." "I imagine so," I said mildly, while thinking about my $340,000 stake in the Riverside development project that was about to make Preston's smaller position look like pocket change. That's when Savannah delivered the line that sealed their fate. "Caleb, dear," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, I hope you don't feel intimidated by all this wealth. We want you to know that we don't expect Hudson's side of the family to contribute equally to the wedding expenses. We understand your limitations." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on their precious marble floors. The moment Savannah Ashworth finished explaining my limitations to me, I felt something shift inside my chest. It was like a door slamming shut on the last 12 years of playing the humble widower, and another door opening onto something much more interesting. "How considerate of you," I said, setting down my wineglass with what I hoped was appropriate gratitude. I wouldn't want to overextend myself financially. Hudson looked mortified, and I almost felt sorry for him. The poor boy had no idea he was about to become collateral damage in what was shaping up to be the most educational experience the Ashworth family had ever encountered. Paige jumped in quickly, probably sensing the temperature drop in the room. "What Mother means is that we want everyone to be comfortable. We've already handled the major expenses, and we understand that different families have different circumstances." Different circumstances. Right. Preston nodded sagely, like he was solving world peace. "The important thing is that we're all family now. Money shouldn't come between family members." Easy for him to say, considering he'd just spent 10 minutes bragging about his net worth while explaining basic investment principles to the simple construction worker like I'd never heard of compound interest. I smiled and made appropriate murmurs of agreement while planning exactly how I was going to educate this charming family about assumptions and circumstances. Because you see, the Ashworth family had just made the kind of mistake that rich people make when they've been rich for so long they forget that other people might have working brain cells. They'd assumed that modest meant poor and quiet meant stupid. After dinner, Savannah insisted on giving me the full tour of their family home, which was really just an opportunity to show off their art collection, their library full of leather-bound books that had probably never been opened, and their master bedroom suite that was larger than my entire house. "The house has been in Preston's family for 4 generations, she explained, running her fingers along the marble mantelpiece in their living room. "We've updated it considerably, of course, but we've maintained its historical character." "It's beautiful," I said honestly, because it really was. "You must feel very fortunate to have such a legacy." "Oh, we do," Paige chimed in. "It's part of why Preston and I are so committed to family traditions. We want Hudson to understand what it means to be part of something substantial, something that lasts." The message was clear. Hudson was marrying up, way up, and his blue-collar family should be appropriately grateful for the elevation in social status. That's when I decided to start phase 1 of what I was already thinking of as project education. "Paige, dear," I said, "I hope you won't think I'm being presumptuous, but I'd love to contribute something special to your wedding. Perhaps the rehearsal dinner. I know it's traditional for the groom's family to handle that." The 3 Ashworths exchanged quick glances. Savannah's smile became just a touch more strained. "Caleb, that's so sweet of you to offer," she said carefully, "but the rehearsal dinner is already arranged. We thought it would be easier for us to handle all the details, given our experience with larger events." "Of course," I nodded. "Then perhaps I could handle the flowers or the photography." Another exchange of glances. Preston cleared his throat. "The thing is, Caleb, we've already contracted with the vendors we prefer to use. They're quite exclusive and probably more expensive than what you're used to working with in Cedar Falls." Ah, there it was again. The gentle but firm message that my small-town budget and small-town vendors weren't up to Ashworth family standards. "I understand completely," I said, and I did. I understood that they wanted complete control over Hudson's wedding so they could showcase their wealth and social position while keeping his family in the background, like embarrassing relatives you had to invite but hoped wouldn't embarrass you too much. What they didn't understand was that they'd just handed me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly what Caleb Henderson was capable of when properly motivated. "Well then," I continued sweetly, "perhaps I could give Hudson and Paige a wedding gift instead. Something that might help them start their new life together." Paige's eyes lit up like a slot machine hitting jackpot. I could practically see her calculating how much the poor widower might be able to scrape together for a wedding gift. "That would be lovely, Mr. Henderson," she said. "Honestly, just having your blessing means the world to us." "Your blessing?" Like I was the village elder bestowing wisdom on the young couple instead of Hudson's father who'd raised him alone for the past 12 years and deserved a little more respect than being patted on the head and told to stay in my lane. The drive home gave me time to think, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, project education was taking shape in my mind. Hudson called the next morning, and I could hear the excitement mixed with uncertainty in his voice. "Dad, I have to ask," Hudson said after we'd covered the basics about the dinner. "You seemed a little quiet last night. Is everything okay? I know the Ashworths can be overwhelming." Overwhelming. That was one way to put it. "They seem like nice people," I said carefully. "Very successful. Paige is lucky to have grown up with such advantages. Yeah, it's pretty intimidating sometimes," Hudson admitted. "Preston's always talking about business deals and investment strategies. I feel like I need to take a finance class just to keep up with the conversation. Has Paige talked about your plans after the wedding? Where you'll live, career goals, that sort of thing?" Actually, Preston offered me a position at one of his companies. Junior analyst with the possibility of working my way up to management eventually. It's a huge opportunity, Dad. Way better than anything I could get with my current experience. I felt a chill run down my spine. Of course, Preston had offered Hudson a job. Nothing like having your son-in-law financially dependent on you to ensure family loyalty. "That sounds generous," I said. "It is. Paige says her dad really likes me, that he sees potential in me. The only thing is the salary is entry-level to start, and they want us to move closer to town so I can be available for evening client meetings and weekend networking events." "Closer to town?" "Yeah, they found this apartment complex about 30 minutes from the office. Paige says it's really nice, and since I'd be making more money eventually, we can afford the higher rent eventually. Always, eventually, with people like the Ashworths. Meanwhile, Hudson would be working for entry-level wages, living paycheck to paycheck, and completely dependent on Preston's continued goodwill for his financial survival." "Have you signed anything yet?" I asked. "Not yet. Preston wants to wait until after the wedding to make it official. He says it's bad luck to mix business with family celebrations. Or maybe Preston wanted to make sure the wedding happened before he locked Hudson into an employment contract that would give him complete control over my son's future." That evening, I called my investment advisor with a very specific request. "Parker," I said, "I want to liquidate $450,000 from my portfolio. I know that's a significant chunk, but I have something important I want to do with it." There was a long pause. "Caleb, that's quite a substantial withdrawal. What did you have in mind? We've talked about being careful with large expenditures that might impact your long-term security." "Don't worry," I assured him. "This is an investment in my son's future. I want to give Hudson and his fiancée a wedding gift that will really set them up for success." What I didn't tell Parker was that the gift was going to set them up for success in ways that Paige and her family would never see coming. Because while the Ashworth family had been busy being condescending and superior, I'd been researching more than just their financial situation. I'd also been looking into Preston's business practices, his competitors, and the local commercial real estate market. And I'd found something very interesting. The shopping center that Preston owned a stake in was about to be sold to a development company that wanted to tear it down and build a new medical complex. The sale would happen in approximately 8 months, and current investors stood to make about a 180% return on their investments over 18 months. But the development company was still looking for additional investors to help fund the purchase. Investors with ready cash and a willingness to move quickly. The kind of investors who might want to buy out smaller stakeholders like Preston Ashworth before the big payday arrived. I spent that entire evening on the phone with lawyers and business managers, putting together what was going to be Hudson's wedding gift and Paige's education in the difference between appearing wealthy and actually being wealthy. The morning after my enlightening dinner with the Ashworth family, I sat in my kitchen with my laptop and a fresh cup of coffee, beginning what I like to think of as my due diligence research. If Preston and Savannah Ashworth wanted to play the wealthy family superiority game, I figured I should understand exactly what kind of wealth I was dealing with. What I found confirmed Parker's earlier research and was even more interesting than I'd hoped. The Ashworth family business empire, while impressive sounding, was built on some surprisingly shaky foundations. Preston's 3 tech companies were heavily leveraged, with 2 showing declining revenues over the past 18 months. His investment firms had mixed performance and what appeared to be significant overhead costs. The various other ventures he'd bragged about seemed to consist mainly of some rental properties and a small stake in a local shopping center that was losing tenants to online retail. The house, while beautiful, was mortgaged to roughly 75% of its current value. Savannah's old money appeared to be more like old debts. Her family's fortune had been significantly reduced by her father's failed business ventures and her brother's expensive divorce settlements. The Ashworth family was wealthy, certainly wealthier than most people in our area, but they were what my financial advisor would call house rich and cash poor. They had assets, but they also had substantial monthly obligations and what appeared to be a lifestyle that required constant cash flow to maintain. More importantly, I discovered that Preston's position in the Riverside Shopping Center development was smaller than he'd probably led people to believe. He owned about 12% of the project, having bought in late and at much higher prices than the early investors. Meanwhile, my position, accumulated quietly over 3 years of strategic purchases, represented nearly 25% of the total development. This information made me smile in a way that probably wasn't very Christian, but I'd stopped worrying about being perfectly Christian around the time Savannah Ashworth explained my limitations to me. I called Hudson that afternoon to check in about wedding plans and to fish for a little more information about his future in-laws. "Dad, can I tell you something?" Hudson said after we'd covered the basics about guest lists and menu choices. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not smart enough for their world. Preston talks about business strategies and investment principles like it's a foreign language." My heart ached for my son. Here was a young man who'd graduated college with honors, worked hard at his job, and had more integrity in his little finger than the entire Ashworth family combined, and they'd made him feel inadequate. "Son," I said carefully, "intelligence isn't about using big words or talking about money. It's about understanding people and making good decisions. You've got plenty of both." "I know, but when Preston offers advice about financial planning and investment strategies, I just nod along. I probably sound like an idiot." "Has he given you specific advice?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Yeah, he keeps telling me about this great investment opportunity in some shopping center development. Says he could get me in on it after we're married, once I prove myself at the company." I nearly laughed out loud. Preston was planning to let Hudson invest in the same development where I already owned a controlling interest. The irony was so perfect it felt like divine intervention. "That sounds interesting," I managed to say. "You should definitely keep that in mind." Phase 2 of Project Education was about to get very interesting indeed. 2 weeks before the wedding, I was sitting in my lawyer's office reviewing papers that would have made Preston Ashworth very nervous if he'd known they existed. But Preston was too busy basking in his role as the generous future father-in-law, giving Hudson his big break in the tech business, to pay attention to what Hudson's humble small-town father might be doing with his time. "Everything is in order, Caleb," my attorney Garrett Stevens said, sliding the documents across his desk. "Henderson Construction Holdings is legally established. Hudson is listed as the primary beneficiary, and the initial funding is confirmed. Are you absolutely sure about this strategy?" I looked at the papers that would transfer my son from Preston Ashworth's employment trap into complete financial independence, and I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. "Garrett," I said, "I've spent 12 years watching my investments grow, while people assumed I was just another widowed construction worker living on life insurance and Social Security. I think it's time Hudson learned that his father isn't quite as limited as everyone believes." The plan was beautifully simple. Instead of Hudson taking Preston's entry-level job at the tech company, he would become the managing partner of Henderson Construction Holdings, a company that would purchase Preston's stake in the shopping center development project, along with several other strategic investments that I'd been monitoring for months. Hudson would start his married life not as Preston's financially dependent employee, but as a businessman with enough capital to compete directly with Preston Ashworth's entire portfolio. The wedding gift would be presented as a modest check that Hudson and Paige could use for whatever they wanted. Maybe a down payment on a house, maybe some furniture, maybe a nice honeymoon. Nothing that would alarm the Ashworth family or make them suspicious. What they wouldn't know until several months after the wedding was that the modest check would be backed by a business structure that would make Hudson independently wealthy within 2 years. But first, I had a rehearsal dinner to attend. The Ashworth family had indeed handled all the details for the rehearsal dinner, which was being held at the country club where Savannah and Preston were members. The guest list was small, just immediate family and the wedding party, which meant I would be spending the evening being graciously tolerated by people who considered me a charity case. I spent considerable time choosing my outfit for this particular performance. Nothing too expensive looking, nothing that would contradict my carefully maintained image as the modest widower, but something nice enough to show that I was making an effort to fit in with their standards. I settled on a simple navy blazer from Sears paired with my father's old watch, the one real piece of jewelry I wore regularly because it looked appropriately sentimental and modestly valuable. What none of them knew was that I'd had that watch appraised years ago, and it was worth approximately $12,000. My father had excellent taste in timepieces, even if he'd lived modestly, just like his son. The country club was exactly what I'd expected. All polished wood and leather chairs, and the kind of understated elegance that screamed, "We have so much money, we don't need to prove it." Savannah had reserved the private dining room, and the table was set with china that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. I arrived precisely on time, carrying a modest gift bag containing a picture frame I'd purchased specifically for this occasion. Nothing too expensive, nothing that would seem presumptuous, just something appropriate for the father of the groom to give to the happy couple. "Caleb!" Paige squealed, giving me one of those air kisses like we were the closest of friends. "You look so handsome. That blazer is so classic." "Classic." "Right. Thank you, dear," I said, handing her the gift bag. "Just a little something for you and Hudson to remember this special time." She opened it immediately, of course, and her smile became just a touch more forced when she saw the simple silver frame. It's very sweet," she said, clearly calculating how quickly she could hide it in a closet after the wedding. Hudson hugged me warmly, looking handsome in his new suit, probably the most expensive clothing he'd ever owned, courtesy of the Ashworth family's insistence on appropriate formal wear for their country club standards. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered. "I know this has all been kind of overwhelming. I really appreciate you being so flexible about everything." Flexible. Another interesting word choice. Preston and Savannah held court at their end of the table, regaling the group with stories about other weddings they'd attended at the club, other social events, other demonstrations of their established place in local society. They were in their element, surrounded by the kind of people who understood the importance of appearances and social position. The conversation flowed along predictably elegant lines until Savannah asked me about my plans after the wedding. "Caleb, now that Hudson will be starting his new position and moving closer to town, you'll probably be rattling around in that big house all by yourself," she said with concern that sounded almost genuine. "Have you thought about downsizing? There are some lovely senior living communities that might be perfect for someone in your situation." "Senior living communities? For someone in my situation?" I smiled sweetly and took a sip of wine that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "That's thoughtful of you to worry," I said, "though I think I'll stay put for now. The house has so many memories and I'm quite comfortable there." "Of course," Preston jumped in, "but as we get older it's important to be practical about these things. Maintenance costs, property taxes, the burden of home ownership. Sometimes it makes more sense to let professionals handle those responsibilities." The burden of home ownership. Like I was some doddering old man who couldn't figure out how to pay bills or call a repair service. "I'll certainly keep that in mind," I said, while mentally calculating that my house was paid off, worth approximately $180,000, and cost me less per month to maintain than most people spent on car payments. That's when Savannah delivered the line that confirmed everything I'd suspected about the Ashworth family's opinion of Hudson's background. "You know," she said, reaching over to pat my hand like I was a confused child, "Paige and Hudson want to have children fairly soon, and we'd love for their little ones to have a grandfather who can really contribute to their upbringing. Someone stable and appropriate." Appropriate. The word hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt my smile become sharp enough to cut glass. "I certainly hope I'll be able to contribute," I said quietly. What I didn't say was that my contribution to my future grandchildren's upbringing was going to include trust funds that would pay for their college educations, down payments on their first houses, and enough financial security to ensure they never had to depend on anyone's charity or condescension, including their other grandparents. The conversation continued with more of the same subtle jabs disguised as concern. Preston mentioned that Hudson might need guidance in understanding money management since he'd never had significant assets to manage. Savannah wondered aloud if I'd ever considered what would happen to Hudson if something happened to me, given my limited resources for supporting the family. Each comment was delivered with such practiced sweetness that anyone listening might think they were being genuinely caring and thoughtful. But I'd spent enough years in the Navy reading between the lines of officer communications to understand exactly what they were really saying. They were systematically dismantling any sense of value or worth that Hudson's family might bring to this union. In their minds, we were the charity case being graciously elevated to their social level, and we should be appropriately grateful for the privilege. The rehearsal dinner continued with toasts and well wishes and all the appropriate social rituals. I played my part perfectly, the grateful small-town father-in-law, humble and appreciative of the Ashworth family's gracious acceptance of Hudson into their social circle. What none of them could see was the envelope in my truck containing Hudson's real wedding gift, or the phone calls I'd be making the morning after the wedding to set in motion the chain of events that would change everything. Because tomorrow, Paige Ashworth would become Paige Henderson, and she was about to discover exactly what that name was really worth. The morning of Hudson's wedding dawned bright and clear, which felt somehow inappropriate for what I knew was going to be one of the most dramatically satisfying days of my life. I'd spent the previous evening double-checking every detail of my plan while pressing my simple father of the groom suit, a modest gray ensemble that had cost exactly $129 at Men's Warehouse and would help maintain my carefully crafted image for just a few more hours. What the Ashworth family didn't know was that I'd spent the past week making phone calls that would fundamentally alter their financial landscape. But first, I had to survive this wedding without laughing out loud at the sheer audacity of people who thought they could patronize Caleb Henderson and get away with it. I arrived at the Ashworth estate at 10 a.m. as requested, carrying a wedding card containing what appeared to be a modest check for $5,000. Enough to seem generous from a small-town widower, but not so much as to raise suspicions about my actual financial capacity. What they couldn't see was the additional paperwork in my truck that would transfer Hudson from Preston's employee to Preston's business competitor by Monday morning. The estate was buzzing with activity. Florists were arranging what appeared to be $30,000 worth of roses and lilies throughout the grounds. Caterers were setting up stations that could have fed half of Cedar Falls, and a string quartet was doing sound checks on the terrace where the ceremony would take place. Savannah was in her element, directing traffic like a general commanding troops, while Paige glided around in a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly budget, accepting compliments on her upcoming transformation from Ashworth daughter to Henderson daughter-in-law. "Caleb," Savannah called, spotting me near the gift table. "How wonderful that you're here early." Paige specifically requested that Hudson's family feel included in all the preparations. Feel included. Right. How thoughtful, I said, placing my card among the collection of envelopes that probably contained enough money to fund a small town's annual budget. "Is there anything I can help with?" "Oh, how sweet of you to offer," Savannah gushed. "But we have everything well in hand. Professional coordination, you understand. We wouldn't want any mishaps on such an important day. Translation: stay out of the way and let the competent people handle things." I smiled and nodded while mentally reviewing the timeline I'd established with my business managers. Phase 1 had already been completed. Henderson Construction Holdings now owned controlling interest in 3 local commercial developments, including the shopping center project that Preston thought was his retirement nest egg. Phase 2 would be implemented Monday morning when Hudson received the complete documentation of his new business holdings. Phase 3 would unfold over the following weeks as Preston discovered that his various investments had been systematically purchased by a competitor who was offering his tenants better deals and more flexible lease terms. But first, I had a wedding to attend and a performance to complete. Hudson found me an hour before the ceremony, looking nervous and handsome in his formal wear. The Ashworth family had spared no expense on his wedding attire: custom tuxedo, Italian shoes, gold cufflinks that had probably cost more than he made in a month at his current job. "Dad," he said, giving me a hug that felt just a little desperate, "I'm glad you're here. This whole thing is pretty overwhelming." "You look great, son," I assured him, straightening his bow tie. "Paige is a lucky woman." "I hope so," he said quietly. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough for all this, like I don't belong in their world." My heart broke a little for my son, who'd been systematically convinced by the Ashworth family that he should be grateful for their acceptance rather than confident in his own worth. "Hudson," I said firmly, "you belong anywhere you choose to belong. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. He smiled, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The Ashworth family had done a thorough job of making him feel like the poor relation who'd lucked into their golden circle. That was about to change in ways that would surprise everyone, including Hudson. The ceremony was set to begin at 4:00 p.m., giving everyone time to complete their preparations and work themselves into the appropriate emotional state for what Savannah kept calling the social event of the season. I spent the afternoon observing the Ashworth family dynamics with the clinical interest of someone who'd studied his opponents and found them predictably shallow. Preston held court with other wealthy guests, discussing business deals and golf games, while Savannah showed off her daughter's elaborate wedding dress to anyone who would listen. Paige herself was the picture of bridal perfection, floating through the preparations like a princess who'd never doubted that the world would arrange itself around her desires. None of them paid much attention to Hudson's simple small-town father, sitting quietly in his corner, wearing his modest department store suit and watching everything with the kind of patient attention that comes from knowing exactly how a story is going to end. At 3:45 p.m., I took my designated seat in the front row, family section naturally, but carefully positioned so that I wouldn't interfere with the photographer's shots of the important relatives. The string quartet began the processional music, and I watched my son take his place at the altar, looking like a man who was about to commit his life to a family that saw him as a charity project rather than an equal partner. The guests had assembled beautifully, 180 of Cedar Falls' social elite, business leaders, and various hangers-on who'd come to witness what everyone assumed would be the marriage of the year. Women in designer dresses that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, men in custom suits discussing stock portfolios and vacation homes. I recognized several faces from the business section of the local newspaper: construction company owners, real estate developers, investment advisors, people who would understand exactly what it meant when the truth about Henderson Construction Holdings came to light. The irony wasn't lost on me that many of these people had probably passed me on the street over the years, seeing only a widowed construction worker in work clothes, never imagining that the modest man in the pickup truck owned more commercial real estate than half the people in their country club. That's when Savannah Ashworth made the mistake that would cost her family everything they thought they owned. She was standing near the gift table, chatting with her sister Margaret about wedding expenses, when she spotted me in my front row seat. I watched her expression change as she took in my modest suit, my simple appearance, my complete lack of obvious wealth or social status. And then she said the words that sealed her family's fate, speaking just loud enough for several nearby guests to hear clearly. "Look at that poor thing," Savannah murmured to her sister, nodding in my direction. "Sitting there in his little discount suit, trying so hard to look appropriate. That's not a father. That's a mistake in work boots." The words hit me like a physical slap, but what followed was even more revealing. Paige, overhearing her mother's comment as she approached for her final pre-ceremony photos, actually laughed and clapped her hands together like Savannah had made the most amusing observation. "Mother, you're terrible," Paige giggled, her voice carrying across the terrace with crystal clarity. "But honestly, he does look like he got lost on the way to a construction site. Did he drive his pickup truck to my wedding?" The nearby guests shifted uncomfortably, some looking embarrassed by the casual cruelty they were witnessing, others smiling in that way that wealthy people do when they think they're among their own kind and can safely mock the help. But what none of them noticed was Hudson, who had been adjusting his boutonniere nearby and had heard every single word. I watched my son's face change as he processed what his bride and future mother-in-law had just said about his father. The uncertainty disappeared from his expression, replaced by something much harder and more determined than I'd ever seen before. The boy I'd raised to be respectful and grateful had just transformed into a man who understood that respect had to go both ways. And that's when I knew that maybe, just maybe, I'd raised him right after all. What happened next unfolded like a beautiful, terrible flower blooming in fast motion. Hudson walked away from the altar, his face set in an expression I'd never seen before, and headed straight for the microphone that had been set up for the ceremony readings. The string quartet faltered to a stop as Hudson tapped the microphone, the sound echoing across the elaborately decorated terrace where 180 guests had gathered to witness his wedding. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hudson said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence, I need to make an announcement. Paige, still holding her bouquet and wearing her $15,000 dress, looked confused rather than alarmed, like this was some kind of romantic surprise she hadn't been informed about. "Hudson, darling," she called out, her voice bright with artificial cheer. "What are you doing? The ceremony is supposed to start." He looked at her for a long moment, and I saw something die in his expression. "Paige," he said into the microphone, 5 minutes ago, I heard you and your mother discussing my father's appearance. You called him a mistake in work boots and laughed about how he looked like he got lost on the way to a construction site. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the marble terrace. Paige's face went white, then red, then white again as she realized that half of Cedar Falls' social elite had just heard her exposed as the petty, cruel person she actually was. "Hudson, that wasn't, we were just," she stammered, but he held up his hand to stop her. "My father," Hudson continued, his voice getting stronger with every word, "raised me alone after my mother died. He worked multiple jobs to put me through college, never complained, never asked for anything in return, and has been nothing but gracious and supportive about this wedding, despite being treated like an unwelcome charity case by your family." Savannah tried to interrupt, rushing toward the microphone with her face flushed red with embarrassment and rage, but Hudson stepped away from her reach and kept talking. "I just realized that I can't marry someone who would mock my father, and I can't join a family that thinks cruelty is entertaining," he said. "So I'm calling off this wedding right here, right now." The gasp that went up from the assembled guests sounded like a collective intake of breath before a scream. Paige dropped her bouquet and lunged toward him, her carefully arranged composure crumbling like a house of cards. "Hudson, you can't be serious. You're ruining everything over a stupid comment." "I'm serious," he said quietly, removing his boutonniere and setting it on the gift table. "And it wasn't a stupid comment. It was who you really are when you think no one important is listening." That's when Preston Ashworth made his own crucial mistake. He stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and rage, and pointed a finger at Hudson like he was disciplining a disobedient employee. "You ungrateful little nobody," Preston snarled, his voice carrying across the terrace for all 180 guests to hear. "We've given you everything, a job, a future, acceptance into our family, and this is how you repay us? By humiliating my daughter in front of our friends?" Hudson looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Mr. Ashworth," he said calmly, "you've given me an entry-level job that would have made me financially dependent on your goodwill for the rest of my life. That's not generosity, that's control." I felt pride swell in my chest as I watched my son stand up to people who'd spent months making him feel small and grateful for their attention. But Preston wasn't finished. His face had gone from red to purple, and the veins in his neck were standing out like rope. "Control?" He laughed harshly, the sound echoing off the marble terrace. "Son, you have no idea what control looks like. You just threw away the best opportunity you'll ever get. You think you can do better than my family? You think your small-town background and your modest father are going to open doors for you?" He gestured dismissively in my direction, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look at him sitting there in his discount suit. That man has spent his entire life working with his hands because he doesn't have the intelligence or education to do anything else. And you're choosing him over us?" The crowd was completely silent now. Even the caterers had stopped what they were doing to watch this unprecedented social meltdown unfold. "You'll come crawling back within 6 months, Preston continued, his voice rising to nearly a shout. "When you're living paycheck to paycheck and can't afford to take my daughter on the kind of life she deserves, you'll remember this moment and regret your stupidity." And that's when I decided it was time to stop being invisible. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my discount suit, and walked toward the microphone with the kind of calm dignity that comes from knowing you hold all the cards in a game other people don't even realize they're playing. "Hudson." "Son," I said gently, "would you mind if I said a few words?" He handed me the microphone with a smile that told me he was ready to hear whatever his father had to say. I looked out at the assembled guests. Cedar Falls' wealthiest families, business leaders, social climbers, and various hangers-on who'd come to witness what they thought would be the social event of the season. Many of these people I recognized from years of careful observation. Real estate developers whose projects I'd invested in, business owners whose commercial leases I'd quietly purchased, financial advisors who'd helped me build wealth they never suspected I possessed. "First," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent terrace, I want to thank the Ashworth family for hosting such an educational afternoon. It's been very illuminating to see how certain people behave when they think they have all the power in a situation. Savannah's face was now an alarming shade of purple, while Paige looked like she was going to faint. Preston, I continued, looking directly at him. You're absolutely right that control is important in business relationships. That's why I spent this week purchasing your stake in the Riverside Shopping Center development project. The color drained from Preston's face like someone had pulled a plug. What are you talking about? He whispered, but his voice was shaky now, lacking the confident arrogance of moments before. I'm talking about Henderson Construction Holdings, I said pleasantly, which now owns controlling interest in several local commercial developments, including the one you've been counting on for your retirement funding. I turned to address the crowd, most of whom were staring at me like I'd just announced I was from another planet. You see, Savannah was right about one thing. I do have limitations. My limitation is that I don't tolerate people who mistake kindness for weakness or modesty for stupidity. I could see recognition dawning on several faces in the crowd. Richard Morrison from Morrison Development looked like he'd just solved a puzzle. Linda Walsh from Cedar Falls Commercial Real Estate was nodding slowly, pieces clicking into place. These were people who knew the local investment landscape, and they were starting to understand exactly who they were looking at. For the past 12 years, I continued, while everyone assumed I was just getting by on my late wife's life insurance, I've been building Henderson Construction Holdings into one of the largest commercial property owners in this county. We own the land under 3 of Preston's business locations, hold controlling interests in 5 major development projects, and have gross assets valued at approximately $1.9 million. The silence stretched until you could have heard a butterfly land on the roses. Hudson, I said, handing him back the microphone, your wedding gift is in my truck. I think you'll find it provides better opportunities than anything the Ashworth family was offering. Preston was now staring at me with his mouth hanging open, his mind clearly trying to process the implications of what I'd just revealed. That's impossible, he managed to say. You're a construction worker. You drive a pickup truck. You live in a modest house. I am a construction worker, I said calmly. I do drive a pickup truck. And I do live in a modest house. But I'm also a businessman who understands that real wealth doesn't require a fancy display. It just requires patience, intelligence, and the ability to see opportunities that other people miss. I looked around at the assembled guests, many of whom were now looking at me with entirely different expressions. The difference between us, Preston, is that I spent 12 years building wealth to create opportunities for my son. You spent years using your wealth to control other people. And with that, I walked back to my seat and waited for the real show to begin. The aftermath of Hudson's wedding cancellation unfolded like a masterpiece of social destruction, and I had the best seat in the house for every beautiful, chaotic moment. The Ashworth family's carefully orchestrated social event had become a public humiliation that would be talked about in Cedar Falls for years to come. Preston was now following me toward my truck, his face flushed with a combination of rage and what I was beginning to recognize as genuine panic. The man who'd spent dinner explaining basic investment principles to the simple construction worker was apparently beginning to understand that I might know more about business than he'd assumed. What exactly do you think you're doing? Preston hissed, catching up to me near the parking area. You can't just make wild claims about business acquisitions. There are legal consequences for defamation. I unlocked my F-150, the same modest truck that had helped maintain my carefully crafted image for the past several months, and retrieved a leather portfolio from behind the seat. Preston, I said calmly, I never make claims I can't support with documentation. I opened the portfolio and handed him a stack of papers that I'd been looking forward to sharing for weeks. His hands actually trembled as he read the investment contracts, property transfer agreements, and business incorporation documents that legally established Henderson Construction Holdings as a major player in the local commercial real estate market. This is impossible, he whispered, his voice barely audible. These properties, the Riverside project, the medical center development. Do you have any idea how much capital this represents? Approximately $900,000 in initial investments, I said helpfully, with projected returns of roughly $2.8 million over the next 18 months, though I suppose that depends on how current property owners negotiate their exit strategies. The implications hit him like a freight train. Not only had I purchased his stake in several developments, I'd positioned myself to control whether his remaining investments would be profitable or worthless. Hudson had approached during this conversation, still wearing his wedding tuxedo but looking more confident than I'd seen him in months. "Dad," he said quietly, "what exactly is Henderson Construction Holdings?" "It's your wedding gift, son," I said, handing him a separate folder from my portfolio. "Congratulations. You're now the managing partner of a business that owns more commercial real estate than Preston's entire portfolio." Hudson's mouth fell open as he scanned the documents that legally transferred him from Preston Ashworth's potential employee to his business competitor. "I don't understand," Hudson said. "Where did this come from? How did you—" "Son," I said gently, "your mother's life insurance policy was $200,000. I've been investing it for 12 years while everyone assumed I was living on Social Security and construction work. Compound interest is a wonderful thing when you're patient and strategic about it." Preston made a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at speech. "You mean," Hudson said slowly, "you've been pretending to be poor this whole time?" "Not pretending to be poor," I corrected. "Living modestly while building wealth quietly. There's a difference between having money and showing off money, though some people never learn that distinction." I looked meaningfully at Preston, who was still clutching the business documents like they might disappear if he let go. "The beautiful thing about real estate investment," I continued conversationally, "is that it's not just about buying properties. It's about understanding market timing, development potential, and strategic positioning. For instance, did you know that the medical center development is expanding faster than originally projected?" Preston's face went ashen. "What does that mean?" "It means they need more commercial space than they initially calculated. They're actively looking to buy out smaller investors at premium rates to accelerate their development timeline." I smiled the kind of smile that probably wasn't very fatherly. Of course, Henderson Construction Holdings is in a position to negotiate those buyout terms on behalf of all current investors. Being the majority stakeholder does have its advantages. That's when the full scope of Preston's situation became clear to him. Not only had I bought his stake in the developments, I was now in position to control the sale terms that would determine whether his remaining investments made him money or cost him everything. "What do you want?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice held none of the condescending superiority I'd been hearing for months. "Want?" I laughed. "Preston, I don't want anything from you. I never did. You and your family assumed I needed your acceptance, your financial opportunities, your social approval. But the truth is, I was perfectly happy before Paige decided Hudson needed to be elevated to Ashworth family standards." As Hudson and I walked back toward my truck, I could hear Preston and Savannah having what appeared to be an urgent, whispered argument about damage control and financial implications. But the real consequences of their assumptions were just beginning to unfold. 6 months later, I was sitting in the executive conference room of Henderson Construction Holdings, watching Hudson conduct a business meeting with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you own the building you're sitting in. The offices were modest but professional. I'd insisted on tasteful rather than ostentatious because the Ashworth family had taught me the difference between having power and needing to display it. "The medical center expansion is ahead of schedule," Hudson was explaining to our development partners. "We should be ready for the final property consolidation by early spring, which puts us roughly 6 months ahead of our initial timeline." The Henderson Group, Hudson's idea for branding our various business holdings, had grown beyond even my initial projections. What had started as my revenge against the Ashworth family's condescension had evolved into a legitimate business empire that was transforming commercial development in our area. After the meeting ended, Hudson and I sat in his office reviewing the quarterly financial reports that showed Henderson Construction Holdings was now worth approximately $2.8 million and growing. "Mom would be proud," Hudson said quietly. "She would," I agreed. "But she'd be proudest that you learned to value yourself properly." My phone buzzed with a text message. Hudson looked at me curiously. "What is it?" I smiled. "Paige wants to meet for coffee. Apparently word has gotten around about your new financial status." "What did you tell her?" "I told her some mistakes can't be undone," Hudson said, "and that I learned from the best teacher I know, my old man. That's when I knew I'd raised him right. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something so successful that their opinions become irrelevant."